Every client of a building is a patron of the arts. A warehouse or a shed or a housing project, that can be a work of art. So let's raise our expectations.
Are you often challenged by developers maybe or clients that they want something more economical or more sustainable?
Yeah, all the time.
All the time, yes.
One of the things I say to clients, I won't do housing that has less than 2.6 meter high ceilings. It doesn't align with my values. I wouldn't want to live there.
Welcome to HubTalks. I'm Klinge, Design Director at Rockfon, and I'm here today with Alison Brooks, Founder and Creative Director at Alison Brooks Architects, London, and we are here to discuss context-driven design.
Thank you, Christian. Pleasure to be here.
So, if we start out with the design approach, you are using cultural research to drive community engagement and new architectural expressions. Can you tell us a little bit why this is so important?
I've always believed that to design responsibly in terms of responsively to place and client and community, we really need to do our homework before we start designing. And that's not just about looking for the physical context, the place, but it's also at the history, the cultural history, the human history, the social history. Look for subcultures, the natural qualities, geography, ecology of places. And we sort of pull all of this research and all of this understanding together to help us form our initial ideas. I think that is our role, to kind of understand, interpret, translate, and through that process, arrive at a creative solution.
Yeah. So before starting the design.
Yes. Yeah. Before starting design, we really need to understand, get under the skin of a place and its culture.
Are you working with anthropologists or?
Not specifically, not professional anthropologists, but we do see our work in a way as being a kind of cultural anthropology or cultural geography. And, you know, architecture is a broad training. It's a broad education. And in particularly where I studied, cultural research and writing and literature in particular were a really big part of the architectural education.
You talk about inclusive city building and how that requires a sensitivity to place and context. Can you give an example from your work?
Sure. I think one of our most recent projects, which is Cadence in King's Cross, is a tower. I call it a courtyard tower because it's a sort of hybrid of a European courtyard perimeter block with two towers emerging from it. It's very much a response to the place of King's Cross. It's the brick, which is a very vibrant orangey red brick, was directly inspired by St. Pancras Station, which is neo-Gothic masterpiece of George Gilbert Scott in the late 19th century. And the sort of exuberance and, in a way, sculptural qualities of that historic train station and hotel was, I see it as a kind of ancestor of my project, which is reinterpreting certain, materials, languages, forms in a contemporary way, and to really reinforce this sense of place, which is King's Cross, very much London, very much a kind of neighborhood identity.
I find it very interesting that you talk about place memory.
I use place memory as a broader term, a sort of more inclusive idea of what place means, a sense of place, because we tend to think of places as being a combination of buildings and public realm and, a bit of urban context. But I think place memory goes deeper than that. It takes in sort of deeper memory of, for example, ecology, the ecologies that once inhabited a place before human habitation, weather and geology, and these kind of senses of a deeper time and a more, perhaps bringing nature into the conversation in a more overt way, and tapping into the spirit of a place, which I think is a whole other kind of topic and sensibility that's been neglected over the few hundred years or more, and really sensing that there are other histories and other memories that were maybe even in our collective subconscious that convey a kind of spirit. It's kind of the way we sometimes speak about architecture as if it has a personality or that architecture speaks to us or a place speaks to us. We attribute language and dialogue with places and the kind of atmosphere of a place is speaking to us. So what does that really say? Does that actually signify a spirit? And I'm very interested in this, and I strongly believe places have spirits.
So it's basically going deeper than placemaking or bringing meaning or identity to space. It's really digging deep in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How does context-driven design lead to unique sculptural design language?
Well, this is another very fruitful outcome, I think, of really investigating and getting in under the skin of a place and its memory. There's so much material there. Once you start digging, there's so much to be inspired by when you have this kind of array of research available. And that is a kind of source, a springboard for new form making, working with materials in new ways. And so this process of translation, of sort of translating that memory into something that speaks of the future. How can I embed these references or these sort of devices or objects or materials or even activities of a place into an architectural language? And this is what I did with the Folkestone Performing Arts Centre, where Folkestone is a seaside town. It's historically a fishing town, and scallops are one of the main things that they fish. And so I reinterpreted the scallop shell as a cladding for that building. So the cladding is scalloped, it's fluted and translucent and slightly salmon, pinkish white like a scallop shell. And I abstracted it into a pattern that it's kind of a quiet cladding, but then at night it glows and it celebrates the creative life of the performing arts happening within. So it's a process of translation, interpretation, and imagination.
Yeah. So you're really taking all these inspirations and then condensing them into the designs. Very nice. Let's talk a bit about the 4 ideals. You have distinguished 4 ideals with which you approach every project. We talk about authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty. At what stage of your career and why did you first outline these?
Well, I decided to declare these ideals in 2017. We had our sort of 20-year anniversary as a practice, and I felt it was a good moment to publish a small book that I called Ideals, Then Ideas. And it came out of, in a way, also teaching and lecturing. And so often students of architecture say, at the end of a lecture, somebody sticks up their hand and says, where do you get your ideas from? Yes. and I think often students are also searching for ideas and they don't know where to look and they don't know what to look for. And so I recommended to kind of help them try to stick to your ideals. Think about what you as a person really believe in your experience, where you grew up, your life experience. Look inside. Don't look all around for something to grab. And the ideals that you hold, people can't really argue with you. So I'm trying to give these students confidence in themselves. Yes. So in this catalog, it's a kind of outline of 20 years of work, the inspirations of each project, the process of each project, and I outline the 4 ideals: authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty. And this was also a way of articulating the importance of these values for every client of a building is a patron of the arts. Yeah. And if it's a warehouse or a shed or a housing project, that can be a work of art. And so let's raise our expectations of what those sheds or that, housing block should be. It should be authentic, generous, civic, and beautiful. And, why not aspire to those four ideals? So that's the kind of origin of those. And I think they're interrelated as well.
Yeah. And were you kind of retrospectively deciphering your work and then identifying these ideals, or was it clear to you what they were?
I think I'd actually spoken about each one of them sort of in my lecture titles. So, one of would be called Authenticity, and it would be about responding to place and building on these relationships between memory and history and ecology and a new program of use. So I'd been talking about those four things kind of separately, and then I thought actually the four together pretty much cover everything I wanted to express. And then I also brought in the word beauty, because I felt that was something that the profession had kind of rejected or neglected as a philosophy, as an ambition. Pretty much since the advent of the modern movement, the word beauty was associated with decadence or ornament, and ornament was crime. And but people love ornament. It's one of the things that most historic places that people love, and the most beautiful neighborhoods and the most visited places are the ones with the most beauty and often quite a lot of ornament. Not that I'm a huge advocate of ornament, but it's just the idea of craft and detail and proportions and workmanship, everything coming together to make a beautiful place. And somehow during the modern era, it was really rejected and nobody was speaking about beauty. So I kind of just put it out there and said, architects and architecture has to reclaim this space of offering beauty to everyone who uses our buildings and everyone who is affected by them.
If we dive into the first one, authenticity, I mean, designers and architects are often talking about authenticity. And typically it would be something with then maybe materials or place, history, form, as you mentioned, but it also goes even deeper. So you use it as a strategy, actually, to develop your concepts or designs.
Yes, authenticity implies a kind of truth, that you're trying to truthfully express values that your client holds, but also the wider community. Pretty much all architecture is public. I consider, the public realm is actually the facades of buildings, not just the ground. The vertical planes are also the public realm. And all of these elements contribute to quality of daily life. So dialing back to authenticity, I think it also has to do with authorship. It's, at a certain point, after you've absorbed all of these influences and all of this research, you have to make decisions and you have to stand by those decisions, the kind of form generating ideas, and the authorship of those ideas is really important. And I think, they're tied to this idea of authenticity. You have to stand by what you do and have the arguments to justify them and hopefully demonstrate that they're not superfluous or trendy. They are authentic responses that have meaning.
And I guess that's well received by clients or developers or Yes, it's been a very successful strategy. I think we've had 100% success rate whenever we submit our projects for planning consent. So yes, I think it works because it's meaningful to people to have that kind of care and effort put into a kind of architectural response. We are eager to understand how you ensure coherence between kind of the architectural concept and then the interiors. So are you often allowed to work also with the interiors and go all the way in the project?
Yes, it kind of depends on the project. Of course, with our private houses, we've always designed the interiors. With the Cohen Quad, which is our project at Oxford University for Exeter College, we designed the building and all the interiors. I really believe there should be a total synthesis between the architecture and the interior. Built-in furniture and joinery is something our firm specializes in. Sometimes with the larger scale residential projects, we work with our clients' interior designer, which is always fine. And we have to work very closely with them to integrate and detail all of their work into our project.
And to ensure that your concepts stay intact.
Yes.
I think I saw pictures from the Salt House. Very nice project with a lot of attention to detail also in the interior. So I think for me, that was a very good example of that. In many of your housing projects, you also see a mix of old and new. Is that kind of a signature also for your work or projects that you often pursue?
Well, sometimes. I mean, I guess the old and new, you could also interpret that as being sort of memory and the now, or memory in the future, and sort of bringing those things together. I think it's actually impossible in architecture to not have some kind of memory in the project. Every work of art or architecture has a legacy, has a lineage, has ancestors. Yes. I think as a profession, we're always working with the past, even a modernist past. Now you see very modernist buildings that look like they could have been designed in 1920.
Yes, yes.
We look for opportunities, and, we always try to invent. Maybe the most experimental project I've done was the Smile, which is this, building in the shape of an arc, which is really unheard of in architecture. And I was trying to think of a form and a silhouette and a space that was completely outside any familiar architectural experience. But at the same time, it's the segment of an arc. It's like a piece of a wheel.
Yes.
It does have a kind of geometric ancestor. Yeah. And it's just bringing that into new form with new material and new structure.
Yes, very nice. When you mix old and new, I'm curious are you deliberately trying to create a distinction? Are you trying to merge new materials or new forms and structures into the old? What is the approach when you work with buildings where you have to work with already existing architecture?
When I work with, say, extending or adding to a historic building, the approach I normally take is to contrast it completely, to ensure that the new work is completely distinctive from the old. And at the same time, there's always a kind of trigger that comes from the place. And for example, the Lens House, which is completely, it's an extension to a late Victorian house, 3-story sort of stately semi-detached house in London. And the extension is sort of low and crystalline and black and faceted and a completely other form and material. But the starting point of those forms was the Victorian bay window, which, has faceted sides and sometimes a pitched roof. And so it was a process of abstracting and expanding and manipulating that very simple thing, the bay window, into a new form.
We had a very unfortunate fire at the old Copenhagen stock building a few years ago. And basically it was left as a ruin. There's only a few walls left and a bit of the interiors, but it actually burned down. And now it's been considered to completely rebuild the old stock building. I can say personally that I was a bit skeptical. I saw it as a big opportunity to actually create something very exciting in the very heart of Copenhagen. What is your opinion? What approach could you take here?
That's a tricky one because people love these historic buildings that have a certain scale and character and detail. But I do feel that, like you, that is a lost opportunity, that in a way the ruin or the remains of that historic building could be preserved as a kind of artifact or a kind of archaeology, and something new that honors that history but brings spaces, the uses, and its performance as a building into the future. So I agree with you. I think it's a lost opportunity, but it would be a super important challenge to come up with a scheme that matched the quality of the historic building.
Yeah, I was just feeling that, rebuilding completely the old structures, the old wooden beams, etc., it's not really the old building.
Yeah, that's a problem of authenticity, right?
Yes.
So I think it would be a more authentic response to try to preserve as much of the remaining structure as possible.
Yes.
And, sort of leave that intact or incorporate it into the new building somehow, but then have a new work that is of our time and hopefully the future.
We'll see. All right, moving on to the next ideal, generosity. That sounds almost criminal these days, with everything having to be very economical, very efficient, very sustainable. So what is your interpretation of generosity in architecture today?
You're right. Generosity is quite a dangerous thing to mention when construction costs are so high and client briefs are very tight. And what I try to do is find those opportunities in any project to embed spaces or find new ways in which a feeling of generosity can be part of the project. For example, threshold spaces, things like porticos, verandas, colonnades, these spaces that are not inside the building, they're part of the exterior, they're somewhere between the exterior and the interior, and those kinds of spaces are relatively economical to build because they're not part of the GIA, and they can make a huge difference in terms of how a building addresses the streets, provides a place of shelter and pause before, entering or leaving a building. Those kinds of spaces I would call generosity that normally are not part of the brief, a threshold or a portico. It's not part of the client brief. The other thing is volume. I really think that ceiling heights have a huge impact on people's sense of well-being. And the more volume and the higher the ceiling, the better people feel. But also the more natural light can penetrate into a space, more connection to the sky. It doesn't have to be wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling glass, but even a vertically proportioned window in a tall space can make relatively small floor space feel generous.
Yes.
And so I'm always fighting for volume and ceiling height, especially in our residential towers developments.
So it goes for all types of projects, even from private housing to large developments or...
Yeah, across everything. I mean, you can always get a double height space in somewhere into a project.
Yes.
It makes all the difference.
Are you often challenged by developers maybe or clients that they want something more economical or more sustainable? Or
Yeah, all the time.
All the time, yes.
Especially with housing, residential, mixed-use developments, clients have such a tight brief and it has to perform, it has to be super efficient. But there is an understanding there's starting to be a broader understanding of the term value, what holds, what is valuable, what does value mean. It's not just net sellable square feet or square meters, it's also relation to access to natural light, access to nature, feelings of generosity. All of these are part of the well-being kind of movement. And that also sells. And developers are also much more attuned to sustainability and through legislation having to support what architects have been doing for years, which is pushing for recyclable, circular economy principles, longevity, robustness, high quality materials, all of these things to reduce carbon. So I think there's kind of coming together of our two kind of mindsets in a way that, say, 20 years ago wasn't really there.
There's kind of a strong movement these years with biophilic designs. Does that also contribute to generosity, that you actually spend resources on biophilic experience?
Yes, absolutely. Being in nature or having access even to a view of treetops of nature has a hugely positive impact on our sense of place, a sense of well-being. I'm kind of obsessed with trees since I was very young, growing up in Canada. And through the process of industrialization and kind of mechanization of our world, urbanization, nature was kind of pushed away and pushed out of the impeding progress. The way that natural systems and ecosystems inform our way of life, now I think we're starting to understand more clearly that really we can't exist. We are codependent. We have to coexist, right down to pollinators and bees and insects and birds. Everything is connected. Trees, climate, water vapor, weather systems, food, it's all connected. And so I think historically architects and architecture has been sort of fighting nature. We have to keep the rain out and keep nature out and keep, growing things out of our buildings. And now we are completely changing that mindset,
bringing them back,
and bringing them back in, which is super positive.
Cool. So the third ideal is called civicness. So I imagine that the ideal of civicness is related maybe mostly to urban master planning or larger public developments, but does it go for all projects?
In my view, yes, it does go for all projects. And I think this ties back to something I was mentioning earlier in our conversation. I think that every built form is giving back to the public realm in some shape or form. And in that sense, I think architecture has a civic duty that goes beyond just the client and the immediate providing of a solution. And this idea of civicness is tying to what we expect of civic buildings, which we expect civic buildings like libraries or town halls or, government buildings to be robust and beautiful and grand and sort of inspiring and uplifting places to be, because it's conveying a sense of care and responsibility to the public as a civic building. But I think all architecture has that role, and in particular housing architecture, urban housing. It forms the greatest context in which we live. I mean, just in terms of quantum, we spend more time in the presence of housing and residential buildings than any other building type in the city. And so the way those buildings address the street, the facades, the facade design, how those proportions, those materials make us feel as part of a neighborhood culture or just somebody passing through, that is a civic role that I think architecture has to deliver.
As we are only working with interiors, could you imagine that you're able to express civicness also in interiors, or at least they are supporting the civicness of the architecture?
Yes, absolutely. It's this idea that the quality and robustness of the exterior should permeate into the interior of buildings. I think before the 20th century, so many buildings did that. The experience of the entrance, the foyers, the grand stair halls, the kind of gathering places were very much an extension of the exterior, coming to the interior and creating that sense of welcome and sort of well-being. And this was done in a kind of Victorian, 19th century, 18th century sense of kind of duty, civic duty that the patrons and clients of those buildings believed in. We need to offer the general population a sense of worth and value, and that's expressed in the architecture. Yeah. I also quite enjoy bringing exterior materials into the building as well.
So connecting
it and sort of breaking down the boundary between inside and outside.
When you work with civicness in projects, what disciplines go in there? We talk about maybe social inclusion, community engagement, or how are you doing it?
Well, it's really a combination of everyone on the team. For example, we don't work alone, and we work closely with landscape architects, obviously engineers, civil engineers, traffic engineers, although that's a big project to sort of rethink how we engineer cities for traffic and cars. That's been going on for the last 20 years. And kind of healing the mistakes that were made in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But we do work with communities, especially if they have representative groups, which often neighborhood forums and neighborhood-wide and local stakeholders who feed back into our process, and we stage events and consultations where we try to get as much participation as possible. So a lot of it is about listening. We pride ourselves on being really good listeners and trying to bring those voices into the process and reflect them back in our work.
Nice. Then the last one, beauty. It's even a daring statement, I would say today. You say that we kind of lost the language of beauty on the way.
Yes, I think beauty is such a fundamental part of what being human is about. Every person longs for beauty in their life. Who doesn't want a beautiful life? Everybody wants a beautiful life. And how does architecture, interiors, the built environment contribute to that? The idea of beauty or the philosophy of beauty was somehow, stigmatized by the modern movement and the drive to sort of cleanse and segregate and mechanize our world.
Yes.
And, strangely associated with a kind of morality, that if you made everything as efficient as possible, you would be good.
Yeah.
You would be a good person. And this was just so misguided and really has, that whole philosophy kind of inflicted a lot of damage on, Europe, cities, North America, and all around the world. There's been a resurgence in sort of craft and just aspiring towards even the understanding of beauty. How do we find beauty? What constitutes beauty? And obviously, this is a complex question that philosophers have been discussing for a few thousand years.
Yes.
But at least, I feel it's a really important part of the conversation. And I think proportions, scale, generosity, volume of, say, interior spaces, they are reflected on the exterior of the building. If a building has mean spaces inside, you can generally see that on the outside as well, to put it in very simple terms. So thinking about proportions, how those proportions are expressed on the exterior, materials, working with beautiful materials, working with natural materials. Like I'm sitting here staring at this timber column, which is, I assume, very old because this is part of an old warehouse. And even looking at the grain of the wood and the knots, I'm looking at a process of natural growth that's expressed in the grain of the wood. And it's beautiful. It's kind of automatically beautiful. So working with natural materials in a way, bringing those into our world in a tactile and visual and acoustic way, all of these contribute to bringing beauty into our lives, into daily experience.
So are you, in a way, on a quest to revitalize the classical virtues of architecture and fight modernism? Or
I mean, the word classical is a little bit dangerous. I wouldn't go as far as classical, but the virtues of architecture, that's an interesting term. But I suppose, it is true that historically there were so many examples of beauty that were produced, also because it was pre-industrial and there wasn't electricity. So you had to have high ceilings to have high windows to maximize the hours of daylight in the day. And also voluminous spaces help with ventilation and air circulation and acoustics. All of these things that they, hundreds or thousands of years of building produced were kind of wiped out in the modern era. So I think we're kind of relearning those lessons. If they're virtues, then that's okay. Let's call them virtues. We're relearning these lessons. The key is to figure out how to deliver them within the cost parameters of, contemporary construction, which is difficult.
Yes. Actually, you're often challenged by the hard KPIs and the budgets, and I guess.
Yes. At a certain point, to stand behind those and challenge them, you have to be able to say no. One of the things I say to clients, for example, our residential clients, is I won't do housing that has less than 2.6 meter high ceilings. That's it. I'm not going to do a housing project with 2.4, 8-foot high ceilings. It doesn't align with my values, and I wouldn't want to live there. So that's the ultimate test. Only design places where you would want to live or work yourself.
Are you able to work with sustainability at the same time? Advocating for sustainable building practices, using sustainable materials. Does that align with beauty, or do you have to fight it in a way to get beauty in there?
I think it aligns completely, to be honest. Part of some of the very simple tactics in terms of delivering more sustainable buildings, which is about reducing energy consumption, reducing heat gain, it's about making more solid buildings. And I've always been an advocate of kind of solidity and mass in my work, and that is automatically more sustainable because you're not,
of course,
creating conditions of overheating with all glass buildings. If they're super insulated, it kind of goes back to the ancient virtues of architecture, where the robustness and thickness and mass of the envelope actually created safe and long-lasting environments.
Yes.
And working with recyclable materials like brick and stone and timber, of course, all of these materials which are carbon storing materials I think they're part of that path back towards beauty.
We discussed the architect's responsibility earlier. What role do you think they should play in advocating for these practices? Do you have a responsibility for taking the lead in the reuse, for example?
We are always trying to both serve our client's brief and fulfill our client's brief, but also lead in a direction that is about sustainability, that is picking materials that are solid and low maintenance, and showing our clients how those add value in the end. For example, in our project in Oxford, virtually all the materials in the ground floor are either stone or concrete or wood. And none of those materials need to be painted ever. That's a cost saving. That's a maintenance saving. So many, millions of gallons of paint are painted every year to maintain public buildings, education buildings. What if you use ceramic tiles or wood or fabric or anything but paint? That is already a huge saving.
Yes. A few Danish architects are taking it quite far by working with projects where they only reuse materials, or everything from taking the old bricks back to finding old windows. And of course, that impacts the architecture quite a lot. So are you looking into also doing reuse projects?
We would love to, and I'm aware of those projects that have sort of miraculously happened here in Denmark and other places. It's very difficult to go down that route in the context of procurement and contracts. In the UK, I don't know if it's different here, but most contractors will only use materials that are certified, that are tested, where it's not just where every component in a build-up is certified and tested in that build-up. So
with a warranty.
And all of those things. So it's very difficult to be able to do any of that kind of work at scale. Private clients, private houses, perhaps, but beyond that, you need a super ambitious, brave, and experimental client who's willing to go down that route. And that's difficult, especially with the kind of insurance industry, where it is as well.
And even with the building regulations as well.
Yes.
I think there's a movement in Denmark towards micro homes or tiny homes or whatever you want to call it. And actually, it turns out that legislation is actually preventing a lot of these projects because they doesn't comply with building codes and building regulations. So maybe we have to change them.
Yes, I totally agree. I think it's sort of swung the other way in terms of what's permissible and what's not. And this is partly to do with the insurance industry. Even before the Grenfell, the disaster in the UK, it's really the insurance industry that's kind of driving what can and can't be done. And these kind of rules that have been embedded in chartered surveyors, sort of handbooks, like insurance surveyors who are adhering to a kind of list of criteria that was written up in 1955 or something like that. The mortgage industry and the finance industry is tied to the surveyors who are tied to their criteria. And it's a super complex system, and I think often the public at large doesn't understand just how complex
it is.
Delivering architecture, delivering buildings is. It relies on so many compliance tests that being super experimental is a very difficult thing.
Yes. Have you been trying to explore new materials like, mushroom-based products or algae or, there's a lot of crazy experiments going on. Could you potentially be looking into that?
Mycelium.
Mycelium, yes.
I mean, it would be great too. And I think there's much more appetite and possibility to use those materials in interiors, in interior design. It's a whole new world out there of sort of biophilic and, self-generating materials. So I look forward to that. It's probably a while before that kind of material will be developed so that it can perform in, freeze-thaw cycles and things like that. But it's a really exciting, and I think it also makes people feel better to know, it's interesting, they're interesting forms, materials, textures, and it just makes you think about the world differently, to be in the presence of materials that are biophilic, natural, they're doing something good for the planet. It makes everybody feel better.
A lot better. Yes, absolutely. We are getting to the closing, and I would like to ask you if you can mention maybe one of your projects that you are particularly proud about, that stands out after more than 30 years in the business.
I think it probably has to be the building we built for Exeter College in Oxford, because not only is it an academic building, it's also a residential building. So it has 90 students living in the building, but also, 3,500 square meters of teaching and academic and social space. So it's like a kind of campus within a building. And we were quite experimental there in terms of spatial organization. Yes. We introduced a new learning commons, sort of multi-level, split-level social learning commons that has completely transformed the way people in the college interact with each other. They're much more connected. They're much more a community. It's sort of reinforced that community. I used a lot of wood, glue lamb, American black cherry, stone, exposed concrete, and a very expressive roof form with stainless steel shingles. It sort of was an opportunity to bring together everything, kind of history, community, with, spatial experimentation and craft in a new way, which was a great opportunity.
Was great. It's a beautiful project.
Thank you.
What are you up to next? What is the next big task?
Well, we have projects really across the world. At the moment, we have some residential towers in Taiwan, and which is really interesting working in that context. And we have projects in Toronto, revitalization of a brutalist building for the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, and a super tall building, 70-story tower on Quayside waterfront project with some Danish colleagues.
With some Danish colleagues, yes, that's right. SLA
and Henning Larsen.
And Henning Larsen, yeah. Well, best of luck with all the next coming projects. And thank you so much for enlightening us on context-driven design.
Thank you.
That was HubTalks. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.